All right, as promised, let's talk about allocative efficiency before closing the chapter on monopolies. Now, we all know that monopolies are bad. We all have a sense of that. Of course, you probably know the popular board game Monopoly. In the 70s, in response to the popularity of the board game, some professor, I believe at Berkeley, invented a game called Anti-Monopoly. You could play as the capitalists trying to develop monopolies or as regulators trying to regulate the monopolies. And without getting into too much detail about the game itself, the reason for its creation was in response to the classic game seeming to suggest that monopolies are a good thing. I think this, if you ask me, it's an not a well thought through critique of the game. Think about what it's like playing the actual game Monopoly. For those of you who've done so, and I think it's still popular enough to where most of you have, right? You play the game and it takes a long time. You work hard to get whatever properties you can. If you win the game, the last few minutes or maybe even half hour of that long game are great for you. If you land on somebody else's property, it's no big deal. You just pay up and move on, whatever. And while you're waiting for it to be your turn again, people just keep landing on your property and you end up getting money. And then when the game's over, you get the satisfaction of knowing you won. But if that's not you, then the game just gets increasingly less enjoyable, right? Every roll of the dice is nerve-wracking, depending on how seriously you take the game, of course, but there are any number of properties that you hope you don't land on. You hope you get lucky and land on one of yours, one of the few that you have left, or one of those squares where you draw a card that is hopefully a good community chest card or something like that. And then, of course, it happens where you land on the wrong property, and then you have to mortgage stuff and whatever, and eventually you're out of the game. So I think the classic game captures the realities of Monopoly pretty well. Monopolies are magnificent for the monopolist, and they kind of suck for everybody else. There was no need for a game to assert one's critiques of monopolies. It pretty well covers why we don't want monopolies, kind of anyway. We've also seen that we've seen why prices tend to be higher when you have monopolized markets and output tends to be lower. But there are a couple other reasons why economists don't like monopolies, and the first is allocative efficiency. Remember with perfect competition, the marginal cost of creating too much output is too high for it to be created. We're not going to get overproduction. We're going to get as much production as people are willing to pay for and no more. But we are going to get that production. People are willing to pay up to the marginal cost, so we end up with the perfect amount of output, as much as people want badly enough to pay for it. But with monopolies, we have a situation where it's just the incentives aren't there for monopolies to produce as much as people need, so we have allocative issues. Productive inefficiency is there because, to be productively efficient, as it says here, use the fewest resources necessary to produce a good or service in competitive markets. That's where the incentives are. But monopolists don't quite have those. They don't quite have those incentives. The great economist John Hicks, one of those guys who maybe should have won multiple Nobel Prizes, and he's also very quotable. He's the guy I quoted earlier in the semester who said that all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. Another of his quotes is, "The best of all monopoly profits is a quiet life." And what he meant by that was there's no incentive to improve the quality of your output. If you have a lot of competitors, remember with perfect competition, your customers can get the same exact thing at your competitor's store for the same exact price, if not a lower price. So what do you do if that price is too low? Well, you have every incentive to try to find ways to improve your output any way you can, so that people might be willing to buy more from you at the market price, or maybe even be willing to pay a higher price. In really competitive environments, maybe not perfectly competitive, and we'll get into a market structure that matches a little better what I just described, you end up with incentives to make better stuff for people. So that's those pressures and incentives aren't there for monopolies. There's one more thing to look at, and it goes back to looking at the monopolists' cost curves and what we would expect to see from here. With perfect competition, we assumed, remember this is the supply curve for the representative firm's marginal cost curve, that's the supply curve, so for the monopolist it's the marginal cost curve. All semester we've been looking at this intersection point. The demand and supply curves intersect here, and we have these triangles, consumer surplus and producer surplus, and no deadweight loss. Every mutually beneficial transaction is there, and perfect competition is based on the market price being set by this equilibrium, and we end up with this market quantity, this market price, no deadweight loss, a whole bunch of mutual benefit. But monopolists, remember, want to produce this lower quantity and charge this higher price. Well, you can kind of see what I'm getting at here, right? We have consumer surplus up here, and we have some producer surplus down here, but remember this triangular region right there is called deadweight loss. You have people on the supply side, or one firm on the supply side, that can produce at this level and charge a higher price, and it's mutually beneficial for them in that sense that they're charging more than it costs them to make the output. But it's not their profit maximizing quantity. Their marginal revenue at that point, their change in revenue, is lower than their change in cost. The fact that they're still operating on a profit makes no difference. They don't want to do this. They want to produce this output, charge this price, and tell all these customers here, sorry, we don't have anything for you. So you have people who would be in the market, mutual benefit that would happen that's not happening anymore. So monopolists have deadweight loss. So as far as efficiency is concerned, they're not allocatively efficient, they're not productively efficient, you get deadweight loss. Sometimes we have to have monopolies again with utilities and with patent law. The long run outlook there, or the alternatives, add up to us concluding that there's really no better way to do things. But if we can find a better way, if we can break up monopolies or regulate without creating more problems, for these reasons, it's often a desirable thing to do. And that's why mergers and acquisitions and such that might create more monopoly power might not end up being allowed. So that closes our discussion of monopoly, and we can get into the other two market structures in the next videos.